Hey, I'm still small, but with your help, I can grow. Please tap the subscribe button below. It's completely free.
The moment Carl leaned back in his overpriced ergonomic chair, laced his fingers behind his head, and gave me that practiced, condescending smile, I already knew something was coming, something I wouldn't like. It wasn't even about the words yet. It was in his posture, the too casual tone, the way he glanced at the sleek little nameplate on his desk like it was some kind of shield. We were in the glass conference room, the one I fought to get installed back when the office was a half-furnished warehouse with duct tape holding down the carpet. That day, the place was full of ferns, minimalist art, and shiny whiteboards that never got used. Carl waited just long enough to pretend it was a conversation, then hit me with the line he must have practiced in the mirror a dozen times before stepping in. "You've hit your limit, buddy. It's time we bring in some new energy. Fresh blood, you know?" For a second, I thought I misheard. After all, I had just closed a licensing deal last month that brought in our biggest client to date. I had just finished mentoring 3 junior devs who didn't know the difference between Java and JavaScript when they were hired. I had just apparently become obsolete. "New energy," he said, as if I was some busted laptop battery that wouldn't hold a charge anymore. My chest tightened, not with sadness, not even with anger yet, just disbelief. I leaned forward and asked him, flatly, who exactly was supposed to bring in this fresh blood? And that's when he said the name, Tyler Green. I blinked. Tyler Green. That was a name I hadn't heard since our Series A days, and even back then, it had been more of a joke than a threat. Tyler was Carl's college roommate, a guy who once claimed HTML was just like Excel, and had a LinkedIn page that listed thought leader before it listed any actual job. Tyler, whose greatest contribution to the tech world was a failed app that tried to turn parking spots into NFTs. And now, apparently, Tyler was going to be Chief Technical Officer. My position, my title, my legacy. I stared at Carl for a long moment, trying to decide whether this was some kind of bizarre prank, a loyalty test, or maybe just Carl finally snapping under the pressure of running a company he didn't fully understand. But no. This was real. This was happening. "Look," Carl said, raising his hands like some preacher trying to calm a restless crowd. "You've been incredible, foundational. No one's questioning your impact. We just need to evolve the culture a bit and—" I cut him off. Not with words, just by standing up. My chair didn't screech. My voice didn't rise. I didn't throw anything, didn't punch a wall, didn't demand explanations or threaten lawsuits. I just nodded, buttoned my jacket, and walked out of the room while he was still mid-sentence. Because if I stayed even 1 second longer, I knew I'd either laugh in his face or say something I couldn't take back. I walked past the glass desks and open-plan workstations, past the interns who still looked at me with the mix of reverence and awkwardness that came with being the oldest guy in the room. Past the wall that still had a photo of me from a TechCrunch panel back in 2013. The caption called me co-founder, but Carl had been working for months to quietly erase that part of the story. I stepped out into the parking lot, where my beat-up Camry sat like a reliable old friend, paint chipping, air conditioning barely working, but loyal. I stood there for a moment, just breathing, while the afternoon sun made everything feel like it was melting in place. I should have felt humiliated. I should have felt crushed. But oddly enough, what I felt most was clean. Because Carl didn't know what I knew. He didn't know that back in 2017, during a particularly ugly funding round, I had quietly separated some of the core IP into an auxiliary shell company to protect it from dilution. Not out of spite, but out of caution. I had watched too many startups implode when the founders lost their grip on the actual tech. The lawyers drew up the documents, the board signed off without reading the fine print, and everyone moved on. But I never sold that shell, never transferred the patents. I just forgot about them. Or maybe I didn't. Maybe some part of me always knew this day would come. Carl didn't know that the fresh blood he was bringing in was going to be trying to lead a ship with no engine, because the engine was mine, legally and practically. I drove home with the windows down, letting the wind whip through the silence. No radio, no calls, just the sound of my life breaking off like a glacier, cracking loud and slow. When I pulled into my driveway, my wife was already waiting on the porch, arms crossed, face unreadable. She didn't ask. I didn't explain. I just said, "It's done." She nodded and walked back inside. Later that night, after the kids were asleep and the house was quiet, I poured myself a drink. Nothing fancy, just whatever bourbon I had left from New Year's, and sat down at my old desktop. The inbox was already buzzing. Some automated HR email with a PDF titled "Next Steps in Your Transition." Some LinkedIn notification from Carl tagging the company's new strategic leadership team. And one message from Tyler. "No hard feelings, man. Excited to carry the torch." I laughed, not loudly, just a soft, low chuckle that tasted like dust, because Tyler had no idea what he'd just inherited. And Carl? Carl had no clue that he had just fired the only person in the building who knew how the damn thing actually worked. Or worse, the only person who still held the keys to the engine room. What would you do if your boss stabbed you in the back like that? Seriously, be honest. Would you swallow your pride and move on? Or would you bide your time and wait, patiently, quietly, for the perfect moment to make them regret ever thinking you were disposable? Me? I just smiled, because my story was far from over. I think the most surreal moment didn't happen in the conference room, or even on the long drive home as I stared at the horizon like it owed me some kind of explanation, but rather in the kitchen that night, when I stood there with a grocery bag in one hand, and my wife's eyes locked on mine with a silence that cut far deeper than any of Carl's empty corporate phrases. She didn't say, "I told you so," though she had every right to. She didn't ask how it happened, or whether there was a chance I could get my job back, or spin it into a consulting role, or land somewhere adjacent and safe. She simply looked at me, not with anger or even disappointment, but with that tired, quiet knowing that only someone who has watched you trade piece after piece of your life for something you swore would be worth it can give you. And then she turned back to stir the soup she'd been making like the end of my career was just one more Wednesday. I stood there for a while, unmoving, holding that damn bag of groceries like it might somehow change the subject. Somewhere in the house, the dog barked at nothing. Upstairs, our teenage daughter was probably blasting music through noise-canceling headphones while pretending her parents weren't aging in front of her. And me? I was trying to figure out where all those years had gone. The late nights under flickering fluorescent lights. The weekends I'd spent drafting pitch decks instead of taking the kids camping. The birthdays I missed under the excuse of, "The team needs me right now." Because that's what I'd been, needed. Or so I thought. Later that evening, as I sat alone in the study, the one room in the house where my name was still on things, framed press clippings and plaques and patents and old prototypes lined up like little gravestones, I booted up the old workstation I hadn't touched in months. I didn't have a plan yet. I wasn't thinking of revenge or redemption or anything as melodramatic as that. I was just looking for something to remind me that I hadn't wasted 2 decades of my life being loyal to an idea that no longer had room for me. I opened my email. Hundreds of unread messages, most of them spam, a few automated reminders about meetings I was no longer invited to, and then, tucked between 2 irrelevant newsletters, one message from 4 years ago, marked with a little blue flag I must have forgotten to uncheck. It was from a law firm I'd used during a particularly chaotic phase in 2017, when we were expanding into biometric software, and there were whispers about a possible acquisition. At the time, Carl had wanted to push everything into a joint IP pool, one of those sweeping legal moves that basically turned our hard work into stock options and goodwill. But I'd been hesitant. I remembered the late-night conversations with the legal team, the endless back and forth about what could be protected and what should be licensed. And in that email, sitting there like a dusty key on a forgotten shelf, was the final confirmation, the core framework. The spine of our adaptive recognition algorithm had been registered solely under my name through a holding company we'd used to simplify the filings. At the time, it was a precaution, a way to keep things clean while we navigated a merger that never happened. And now it was my lifeboat. I sat back in my chair, blinking slowly as the implications started to line themselves up in my mind, like dominoes waiting to fall. The company had grown, yes, but everything it was still depended on that framework. Every update, every feature rollout, every buzzword-laced press release Tyler would be fumbling to approve now that I was gone. They could fire me, scrub my name from the website, even replace my keycard with Tyler's smug face, but they couldn't rewrite the legal registry. And they couldn't launch their next version without infringing on something I still owned. Not symbolically, not emotionally, but legally, contractually, indisputably. It was funny, in a way, how cleanly they had cut me out. That very day, I had received a LinkedIn notification congratulating me on 22 years at Omnivox, an algorithmic cheer for a milestone that no longer existed. Beneath it, a post from Carl with a photo of Tyler smiling in front of a whiteboard he didn't understand, holding a dry erase marker like it might bite him, captioned with something about future forward leadership and bold new directions. I scrolled through the comments. Dozens of likes, a few bootlicking congratulations, and one particularly galling remark from a junior engineer I had mentored for 3 years, excited to see where we're headed. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the study with the lights off, the faint glow of the monitor painting everything in a shade of late-night melancholy, and I thought about what it meant to give everything you have to something that will never love you back. I thought about the time I missed my son's school play because we had an investor call moved up last minute. I thought about the months I spent sleeping in hotel rooms with views of nothing, eating takeout and pretending it was the grind. I thought about every employee I'd quietly covered for, every bonus I'd declined so we could retain just one more position, every next year we'll fix it conversation that never turned into action. And yet, through all that bitter self-reflection, a quiet clarity began to form. Not rage, not yet, but resolve. I wasn't going to rant on social media or storm the office with lawyers and demands. I was going to wait, watch, and make absolutely sure that when I moved, it would be the kind of move they'd never forget. Because I wasn't just a bitter ex-employee. I was the architect of the very thing they were now clumsily trying to scale without instructions, and they hadn't even noticed that the foundation still had my name carved into it. By sunrise, I had reread every legal document I'd saved, highlighted the relevant clauses, and even found the original contract from the development grant that helped fund the patent in the first place. It was all still intact. Everything I needed was sitting right there, in plain sight, ignored, unacknowledged, but very, very real. They thought they'd buried me with a plaque and a pink slip, but all they'd really done was give me the time I needed to remember just how much of this house I still owned. It's strange how quickly bitterness can turn into focus when you've got nothing left to lose and everything to revisit. The morning after I rediscovered the patent documents, I found myself pacing around the house with the kind of manic energy usually reserved for last-minute product launches or red-eye flights to investor meetings. Only this time, there was no flight, no calendar invite, no deliverables. There was just me, a thick stack of forgotten legalese, and the slow, creeping realization that I had been sitting on a loaded weapon for years without even knowing it. Or maybe I had known, somewhere deep in the back of my mind, and I just hadn't wanted to believe that the day would come when I'd need to use it. I called Saul Rosen that afternoon, a name I hadn't spoken aloud in at least 5 years, but whose business card I'd kept tucked in a drawer full of old lanyards, startup swag, and notes scribbled during long-gone hackathons. Saul wasn't the kind of lawyer who put his face on billboards or led seminars in hotel conference rooms. He was the kind who understood how things really worked. The kind of guy who could read a clause and already smell the lawsuit you'd be hit with 3 fiscal quarters down the road. When he answered, his voice was gravelly and suspicious, like he was halfway through chewing something he didn't trust. But as soon as I said my name and mentioned the patent, there was a pause, followed by a low whistle and a laugh that made it clear he understood exactly what I had just placed in his lap. We met the next day in his basement office, a cramped, windowless space filled with mismatched furniture and piles of files that looked like they hadn't been touched since the Bush administration. Saul didn't offer coffee. He didn't ask about the kids or whether I was doing okay. He just sat down, put on his half-moon glasses, and started reading. For a while, the only sound was the rustling of paper and the occasional grunt of disbelief. Then he looked up at me and said, with the dry amusement of someone who'd seen 1,000 corporate betrayals, but still appreciated a good twist, "So, they're using this tech right now?" I nodded. "All of it? Every major feature since 2018. He let out another low whistle and leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping together in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "You've got them by the balls," he said, with the kind of certainty that made my stomach flip. Not out of fear, but out of the giddy, dangerous excitement that comes when you realize the tables have turned and no one even saw you pull the lever. We spent the next several hours going through everything: the filings, the timestamps, the public announcements, the product demos, the press releases. It all pointed to one thing. They had built their shiny new empire on infrastructure that was never, at any point, fully theirs. I remember asking Saul if it was really that simple, if I could just send a cease and desist and watch the whole machine grind to a halt. He gave me a look, the kind that said I was asking the wrong question, and said, "It's not about stopping them, it's about bleeding them, slowly, legally, and publicly." And that's when it clicked. I didn't want to destroy the company. Not right away. I didn't want to be the bitter old founder who nuked the castle because he wasn't allowed to sit in the throne anymore. I wanted to make them sweat. I wanted Carl to wake up at 3 a.m. with his phone blowing up from legal alerts. I wanted Tyler to stand in front of a whiteboard and realize that he couldn't rewrite a single line of code without stepping into territory he didn't own. I wanted the board to start asking questions, the investors to get nervous, the PR team to scramble. So I began laying the groundwork. No lawsuits, not yet. Just filings. Quiet, sharp, precise. Notices to the patent office reaffirming my ownership. Updates to the IP registry, now linked directly to my personal trust. An application for international protection just to make sure they couldn't pivot offshore and dodge the implications. I set up alerts on every news article, every code push, every product announcement. I created a digital paper trail so clean, so thorough, that if they ever tried to argue otherwise, they'd be painting themselves into a corner with their own press releases. And I didn't do it alone. Saul brought in a few trusted colleagues, ghostwriters in the legal world, the kind who knew how to write demand letters that didn't scream, but whispered promises of ruin in carefully measured paragraphs. We crafted the kind of correspondence that made you reread it 5 times, sweating by the end, not because of what it said outright, but because of what it implied was coming next. We timed everything around their upcoming keynote, the one Carl had been hyping on social media for months, where Tyler was supposed to unveil their next-generation platform to a live audience, and a dozen tech journalists eager to cover their comeback narrative. And I watched the LinkedIn posts pile up, watched the buzz build, watched the excited comments roll in from employees who were too young or too distracted to realize they were about to walk straight into a very expensive trap. I watched Carl rehearse the same old phrases: synergy, scalability, seamless user experience, and I imagined the look on his face when he finally realized none of it could ship without my permission. Every line of code, every function call, every goddamn API, it all flowed through systems that bore my name in black ink on white paper, buried beneath 6 years of corporate amnesia. At night, I'd sit by the window with a notepad, scribbling ideas not just for retaliation, but for reclamation. What would it look like to start over, this time, without the dead weight, without the politics, without Carl? I didn't know yet. I wasn't rushing it. What mattered now wasn't speed. It was precision. The slow, deliberate kind of movement that made every step feel earned, every breath calculated, every smile part of the strategy. They thought they had replaced me. What they had really done was free me from the meetings, the politics, the lies, and most importantly, from the illusion that I was powerless. They had taken the credit, taken the office, taken the title, but they had forgotten to take the foundation. And the devil, as always, was still hiding in the fine print, waiting for someone to actually read it. There's a particular kind of dread that sets in when someone realizes they've been handed the reins to a machine they don't know how to operate. And in Tyler Green's case, it became evident with almost comical speed that he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. Not just in terms of technical competence, which had always been shaky at best, but in the deeper, more dangerous sense of organizational instinct, the ability to read a team, sense unrest before it surfaces, and steer a ship through a storm without announcing to the passengers that the hull's already taking on water. The first real cracks showed up a week after their big internal strategy meeting, which, of course, I wasn't invited to, but which someone from inside the engineering team, still quietly loyal to me, was kind enough to summarize in detail through an encrypted email chain. Tyler, it seemed, had come in with a slide deck full of buzzwords, half-baked diagrams, and a completely imaginary understanding of our back-end systems, confidently announcing plans to streamline the architecture and modernize our modular framework, as if he hadn't just stumbled into a labyrinth of code that I had personally refactored, optimized, and secured with redundancies so intricate that even the senior engineers treaded carefully when poking around in it. His first mistake, the one that made people start whispering, was assigning a redesign task to the junior dev team without realizing that the components he was telling them to rewrite were deeply interdependent and tied directly into licensed third-party services with strict usage parameters. Within 48 hours, half the staging environment was in shambles. API calls were bouncing off non-existent endpoints, and customer feedback on the beta version, which I had warned Carl never to push out prematurely, began rolling in with the kind of brutal clarity only found in unfiltered App Store reviews and profanity-laced support tickets. Tyler responded not with humility, not with curiosity, but with defensiveness wrapped in corporate fluff, blaming legacy constraints and technical debt for problems he had created in his first week, problems he barely understood, and problems he had absolutely no business trying to fix. Carl, meanwhile, was doing what Carl did best, pretending everything was fine while desperately trying to project confidence to the board. His solution was to double down on PR, pushing out article after article about bold new directions, while internally ramping up pressure on the team to deliver a product that was now 2 months behind and being held together with duct tape and blind hope. I watched it all unfold from a distance, a quiet observer in the shadows of the very system I had built, and for the first time in years, I felt something dangerously close to pleasure. Not because they were failing, but because their failure was so precisely predictable, so painfully avoidable, and so richly deserved. It wasn't just technical incompetence that defined Tyler's presence. It was the culture shift he brought with him, that shallow, startup chic energy where meetings replaced action, where personality was mistaken for leadership, and where merit took a backseat to optics. He instituted mandatory innovation sessions, which were essentially brainstorming circles where no one was allowed to criticize an idea, no matter how absurd, and where he would spend entire hours talking about user journey metaphors and gamification layers, while completely ignoring the engineering roadmaps that had been carefully crafted to avoid exactly the kind of chaos he was now encouraging. Senior developers began calling out sick more frequently. Mid-level managers quietly updated their resumes. One lead engineer, someone I'd mentored since his internship, sent me a message that simply read, "It's like watching a house slowly burn from the roof down, and the guy with the matches keeps insisting it's just a new type of fireplace." And still, Carl refused to see the pattern. Or maybe he saw it and couldn't afford to admit it. He had made his bet, brought in his old friend, fired the guy who built the engine, and now he was stuck pretending the engine was still running, even as smoke poured from the dashboard. What made it worse, And for me, a touch poetic, was that they had no idea I was the one pulling the levers on the background. Every time they tried to pivot, every time they drafted a new feature that rested on my architecture, every time Tyler stood in front of the team and tried to inspire confidence while reusing the same two phrases like they were scripture, I was there, watching, documenting, waiting. What Carl and Tyler both failed to realize was that modern tech is built on foundations you can't just swap out like interchangeable parts. You can't rip out the soul of a system and expect it to keep breathing. And more importantly, you can't erase the hands that carved the thing out of nothing in the first place. I hadn't just written code. I'd designed systems around specific philosophies: stability, security, modularity. I had layered in protections and compliance structures that took years to perfect. They thought they were inheriting a plug-and-play system. What they had actually taken over was a living organism that required care, intuition, and above all, understanding. As their big product announcement drew closer, I could feel the tension rising in the company's public communications. Social media posts became more vague, release dates shifted from specific to seasonal, and marketing emails started leaning heavily into nostalgic language, invoking the company's roots and legacy, the very legacy they had erased when they decided I was expendable. It was like watching someone try to speak a language they'd only ever seen written down and pronounce every word wrong, hoping no one would notice. But I noticed, and so did the people who mattered. Investors began asking questions, not publicly, not yet, but the tremors were there. A delayed feature here, a missing compliance update there, a sudden resignation from a VP who cited family time, but posted a job offer from a competitor within a week. And through all of it, Tyler remained blissfully unaware that every step he took was leading him further into a corner I had built brick by brick, lined with documentation, deadlines, and the subtle legal constraints they had never bothered to read. I didn't gloat. Not openly. I simply tightened the circle, filed one more update, tracked one more dependency, positioned one more trigger. The Tyler problem wasn't just a leadership issue, it was a countdown. And I already knew how it was going to end. It began not with an explosion or a confrontation, not with lawsuits or headlines or anything loud and cinematic, but with a single, measured letter, 3 carefully structured paragraphs drafted with surgical precision, printed on thick paper with my name at the bottom, notarized, time-stamped, and delivered by courier directly to the legal department of Omnivox Systems at 9:02 a.m. on the morning of their highly anticipated product launch, the one that had been teased in tech blogs for weeks and hyped internally as a transformational leap forward by a marketing team that had no idea the very technology they were about to unveil had been built on intellectual property I still owned outright, contractually and irrevocably. The letter itself wasn't hostile. It didn't need to be. It simply outlined the legal boundaries of my patent, cited the exact modules of code currently deployed in their production environment that fell under infringement, referenced the original documentation from 2017 with the appropriate timestamps, and concluded with a firm but polite notice of pending injunctive relief if the offending material was not removed from all public platforms immediately. No threats, no drama, just an unassailable wall of facts, assembled with the kind of calm confidence only a man who has already done the math can muster. The reaction was almost immediate. Within hours, I started seeing the signs. The launch livestream, which had been scheduled for 11 o'clock a.m., was suddenly replaced with a technical difficulty screen and a looping elevator music track that sounded increasingly surreal the longer it played. Social media posts promoting the event were quietly deleted. The countdown timer on their homepage vanished, and by late afternoon, a carefully worded statement was issued by the company's PR team, citing unexpected compliance considerations and announcing a temporary postponement of the product rollout to ensure the highest level of quality and legality. But behind the scenes, I knew the panic was spreading like a virus through every department. Legal was scrambling to verify the claims. Engineering was being pulled into emergency meetings to try to rewrite systems they didn't fully understand. systems Tyler had promised could be tweaked in a weekend, but that in reality had taken me over half a decade to develop layer by layer, with deliberate interdependencies and proprietary methods that couldn't be untangled without tearing the whole structure apart. Carl, of course, was trying to play it cool, maintaining an air of control for the board while sending increasingly frantic Slack messages behind the scenes, hoping someone, anyone, could explain how this had happened and how quickly it could be undone. What they didn't realize, at least not yet, was that the damage had already been done, not because of the letter itself, but because of what it symbolized, that they were no longer in control, that someone they had discarded without a second thought still held the keys to the kingdom, that all their bravado and posturing and inspirational emails about innovation and agility were meaningless when the foundation they stood on wasn't theirs to claim. In the following days, I watched from a distance as their stock dipped, not catastrophically, not all at once, but steadily, like a tire with a slow leak that no one can quite locate. Analysts speculated vaguely about internal shakeups and delayed revenue recognition, while tech journalists, ever hungry for a new narrative, began to circle with questions about the company's leadership, about Tyler's qualifications, and about whether Carl had made a critical error in replacing the architect of their core technology with a man whose last venture had ended in a class action lawsuit from disgruntled beta users. And still, I said nothing publicly. I issued no press statements, gave no interviews, didn't post a single cryptic line on social media to stoke curiosity. Because this wasn't about spectacle. It was about principle. It was about finally reclaiming something that had been taken from me. Not just the company, not just the position, but the respect, the acknowledgement, the simple truth of what I had built and what it had cost me. I wasn't trying to destroy Omnivox. I was simply taking back what was mine and letting them deal with the consequences of their arrogance. The real beauty of it, though, the part that tasted sweeter than any public vindication ever could, was in the quiet fallout. I began receiving emails from former colleagues, the ones who had stayed silent when I was pushed out, now reaching out in a mixture of apology and awe. Some asked if I was hiring. Others just wanted to say they were sorry for not speaking up. A few confessed they had never really believed Tyler was capable, but hadn't known how to navigate the politics. It didn't matter. I wasn't keeping score. I wasn't collecting favors. I had no interest in building a new empire out of bitterness. I just wanted to move forward with the clarity that comes from having nothing left to prove. I remember sitting on my porch one evening, not long after everything fell apart, a cup of black coffee in hand, the sun setting behind the trees in that slow, golden way that makes everything feel like a painting, and thinking to myself how absurd it all had been. The 22 years of sacrifice, the endless meetings, the self-imposed martyrdom of the founder who never took a vacation, all for a company that discarded me the moment I became inconvenient. And yet, in that moment, I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt free. I could have sued. I could have dragged them through court, demanded damages, humiliated them in front of their investors. But I didn't. Instead, I let the silence speak for me. Let the paperwork, the patents, the years of careful documentation whisper the truth they had tried so hard to bury. And I knew that truth would echo in their halls far longer than any lawsuit ever could. Maybe some people will say I went too far, that I should have walked away, started over, turned the other cheek. Maybe they're right, but I wasn't trying to make a point. I was just finishing what they started.